Man of the world, man of the jet set, celebrity aviator.
Also with
A past as a soldier, lover of the good life, lover of beautiful women. Talked about, no, we're not talking about Howard Hughes. I know most of you thought about it. You may have thought of the old Leonardo DiCaprio movie, The Aviator. No, it's true, even though there are many similarities. Today's character is not Howard Hughes. It's another character who, for a certain period, was contemporary with Howard Hughes. And he had a very different trajectory, at least as far as the rest of his life is concerned. A life that ended at just 44 years of age, an adventurous life with many contradictions, a life spent chasing speed, chasing risk, chasing his career, his desire to stand out, chasing violence, chasing political notoriety, and not only that, even at the cost of clashing with the strongest personalities of the time. Today's video is dedicated to Italo Balbo, the man who dared to challenge Mussolini.
perhaps he also considered the Leonardo DiCaprio film 2 years ago. No, it's true. Even though there are many similarities, today's character is not Howard Hughes.
A bit of everything has been said about Italo Balbo. There's even some mystery still lingering today about his death, but we'll talk about that later. What is certain is that much has been said about Italo Balbo's military career, about his passion for aviation, to the point of being essentially recognized as the founder of the Royal Air Force, what is today the Air Force. Not only has Italo Balbo's social life been discussed, his lovers, how charming and fascinating he was. Even abroad, even for populations very distant from the Italian one, Italo Balbo has been much discussed, but who was he truly? Raised in Ferrara and later becoming a war hero during the Great War, Balbo had a somewhat troubled childhood. A bright, intelligent boy, but according to some of his teachers at the time, with little desire to apply himself and study. In short, the classic could do more. He skips 5th grade to go straight to middle school, but he struggles. His parents send him to a boarding school in San Marino to try to advance his studies. No use. Meanwhile, Balbo, not even 18 years old, is getting into politics. He has socialist and Republican sympathies, especially Republican. After all, the area between Ferrara and the adjacent Romagna of Ravenna is an area of great Republican tradition. And during that period, at the beginning of the 20th century, the demand for agrarian reforms brings to all that area, the area of Polesine, the area around the Po, the sympathies of the farm workers towards the Socialist Party. Huge social fractures are created indeed between the agricultural labor force and the masters, the landowners who instead have very conservative ideas. In this context, the young Balbo grows and grows to the point of marrying the interventionist idea. When he is just 18 years old, Balbo is a convinced advocate of the need for the Kingdom of Italy to go to war. But it will take a little year before Italy is convinced by the agreement to denounce the Triple Alliance and to go to war alongside the United Kingdom, France, and the Tsarist Empire. It will take a while. And when Italy enters the war, Balbo enlists but spends little time at the front, soon returning home. The problem is that the Royal Army needs soldiers and also officers. Balbo somehow manages, that is, some say with a little push perhaps, due to his political friendships, perhaps due to the influence of his family, to obtain the higher license and with that, the rank of officer in the Alpini Corps. He is sent to Carnia, then he is sent to Piedmont. Meanwhile, the importance of a new, very young weapon, the aeronautical one, is becoming increasingly evident. We think that essentially the first flight took place about a dozen years earlier, and that in 1911 Italy established, so to speak, a record not exactly to be proud of, for having carried out the first acts of war from the sky with airplanes, obviously rudimentary actions. But Balbo is fascinated by the potential of airplanes. He transfers to Piedmont to experiment with the possibility of flying. His problem is called the route of Caporetto, because after Caporetto there is no more time for him to dedicate to flying. He is called back to the front and right to the front. He will fight again and will be among the officers who will liberate the city of Feltre after the Battle of Montegrappa. Here, Balbo begins to become a name known also because he returns home with honors and decorations. He also comes home with a girlfriend who has blue blood in her veins, as they used to say. It's a girlfriend who is the young Countess Emanuela Florio, the daughter of Count Florio of San Daniele del Priuri. They met during the war. Count Florio disapproves of his daughter, the young countess's relationship, with what he considers to be a good-for-nothing, a scoundrel, a man with rough manners who comes from the countryside. Count Florio does not like Italo Balbo, so much so that the couple has to wait until 1924, when Count Florio dies of natural causes, to be able to get married. Balbo. From that moment on, he increasingly seeks a path to politics and glory. Jobless after the war, Italo feels lost. He turns to Freemasonry for guidance during this uncertain time. He is initiated into a lodge in Ferrara, the Girolamo Savonarola, under the obedience of Piazza del Gesù, the Masonic communion that arose a few years earlier from a split of the Grand Orient of Italy. On the other hand, he approaches politics again, but no longer the socialists. He maintains friendships at the Republican level, but from 1920, he comes into contact with the emerging National Fascist Party. Does Balbo have a successful career with the fascists? Initially, he requests to retain the double card, including the Republican one, but his request is rejected. When fascism bans Freemasonry, already for its own adherents, even before the law on associations, which we have already talked about in another video that I invite you to review. Well, Balbo votes against it, but he is in the minority. There are only 3 other leaders who vote against. With him, Cesare Rossi, Giacomo Acerbo, and Alessandro Dudan. So he is forced to put himself to sleep, as they say, that is, to abandon his lodge. He must choose either fascism or Masonry. He chooses fascism, and with fascism, he begins to make a career. He makes a career because he takes on the role of Federal of Ferrara, and not only because as a Federal of Ferrara, he can control the area. Italo Balbo becomes a Ras, as they say in the environment. He is someone who controls everything and especially puts himself in charge, thanks to his military field experience. Of the squads, the punitive teams, the black shirts who seek confrontation with the Reds, the socialists and the communists, and who are paid for this by the large landowners. We are in the Red Biennium, the first post-war period. Soldiers have returned from the front to everyday life in the fields, but there are no jobs. There are strikes in the factories, the big industrialists, the landowners. They finance the fascist militias to restore order according to what they think. They don't trust the state. During that period, Balbo organizes the squadrons. He takes them to beat everyone, the rebels, all the peasants who oppose the owners' lockouts. When a prefect even decides to ban the public carrying of the truncheon, Balbo reacts in his own way. He has his men replace the truncheon with dried cod. Those dried fish that are then rehydrated and cooked work the same way. You no longer get beaten with a truncheon, but with dried cod. The bruises and hematomas are similar, yet distinct each time. After the punishing journey, it's time to eat. It all seems so incredible, doesn't it? It's almost a bucolic squadism, but there's nothing to joke about. There's really nothing to do. Jokes aside, Ravenna's population realizes it when Balbo organizes the Column of Fire between July 26-27, 1922, after a fascist sympathizer's murder. With threats, he gets some vehicles from the prefects of the area on which he loads his squad members. He takes them to Ravenna, and along the way, he sets fire to and destroys all the people's houses he finds. He terrorizes the territory from Ferrara to Ravenna for 48 hours, asserting his dominance over the area. It is during this time that Balbo clashes with a very energetic socialist politician, Giacomo Matteotti. They don't like each other, that's clear. At Matteotti's rallies, there is always some spy sent by Balbo who wants to be informed about everything. We know what happened to Matteotti. His willingness to denounce the violence of the emerging regime, the violence of the squads, and a certain widespread malfeasance will cost him his life. First of all, there's the March on Rome. Mussolini has decided to seize the government by force, betting on the fear of the sovereign. who, according to his calculations, will not have the courage to accept the army's proposal to declare a state of siege and to shell the fascists. Balbo, who has now made a name and reputation for himself, is called to lead one of the columns that will converge on Rome. Michele Bianchi, selected by Mussolini, is one of the quadriumvirs. Balbo recruits Cesare and Maria de Vecchi, fellow Masons at Piazza del Gesù, who, like him, have fallen asleep. Emilio de Bono is selected, although not the first choice. Teruzzi or Gandolfo are preferred, but unavailable due to various reasons. They are betting on this old soldier de Bono. Before arriving in Rome, Balbo shows all his political skill by going to Florence, defusing what would be a terrifying bomb for fascism. Why Florence? Tullio Tamburini, head of the Squadrax, has targeted none other than the Duke of Victory, Armando Diaz, who is in town for a reception. Tamburini wants to arrest and beat all the officers, including Diaz, but the reason is unclear from the given context. They are interfering in fascist matters. Balbo arrives, calm. Tamburini releases the officers. He orders that Diaz's passage through the city be greeted with applause, flower throwing, and everything that is due to a war hero. It's an exceptional propaganda move. Perhaps for this reason the Reggio army softens. Perhaps for this reason the King of Italy does not sign the state of siege. Perhaps for this reason. The march on Rome ends with a success, and Mussolini can obtain the agonizing task of head of government. From that moment on, Balbo becomes a government man. He becomes part of the Grand Council. He becomes the general commander of the Voluntary Militia for National Security. In short, the squads that give themselves
an organization
like a paramilitary militia. He even founded a newspaper, the Corriere Padano, which was essentially to serve as the master's eye in Ferrara and its surroundings. The direction was entrusted to a personal friend of Balbo, Nello Quilici, the father of the very famous Folco Quilici. A few months later, Balbo begins to have the first problems. The first problem comes right from his area, from Argenta, province of Ferrara, agricultural countryside. There, his squad members have killed a priest. The archpriest Don Giovanni Minzoni was beaten to death.
Why? Because
Minzoni opposed fascist practices, because Minzoni supported the local youth, the teaching to the youth, and the claims of the farmers, of the laborers, of those who would like to work the land without dying of hunger. Minzoni is killed, and everyone looks towards Balbo. If it was his squad, the order could only have come from him. But in the end, Balbo gets away with it. The charges against him are dropped, most likely out of interest. Even the Mariotti murder actually leaves some aftermath. But no one thinks that Balbo could be involved. Moreover, then, Mussolini's speech in January 25 will clear the field of doubts. November 6, 1926 is a very special date for Balbo. He is appointed as the Secretary of State and Minister of Aeronautics. That aeronautics, which is still quite embryonic, that for many years has lived on experiments, that was entrusted a bit under the guardianship of the Reggio Army. So much so that during the Great War, all the pilots were cavalry officers. Well, that Air Force becomes independent. Balbo, who still doesn't have his pilot's license, will get it. In 1927, he becomes the patron name of the Italian Air Force. He starts the foundation of the so-called City of Air. Agadonia creates an experimental research center on high speed in Desenzano del Garda. He promotes Italy's participation in the Schneider Cup, the competition specifically for the high speed of airplanes. In short, Balbo becomes the patron of what will become the so-called blue weapon, the Air Force. And it is here that he makes his first enemies in the Army, which sees the control of the emerging Air Force taken away. And in the Navy, because Balbo stands in the way of the Admiral's request to have aircraft at their disposal for reconnaissance, and especially based on land to accompany naval squads and for high-altitude bombing missions, that is, well offshore. The relationship with the other military personnel will be quite difficult. It will become critical in September of 29 when Balbo is recognized as an Air Force general at just 33 years old, very young. This rapid promotion also displeases a good part of the military spheres, who see themselves overtaken outright by this arrogant boy from the Ferrara province. But Balbo has other ideas in mind. He wants to magnify, more than the regime, his own role with the Air Force and begins to study spectacular demonstrations, the oceanic flights, what had succeeded years and years ago to Charles Lindbergh, who had flown nonstop from the United States to Europe. Balbo wants to do it again, not alone, in solitude, with new seaplanes that are an example of both Italian technology and the ability of Italians to excel, even in the sky. The first flight to Brazil in 1931 was a great success. It's such a success that the president of Brazil, Getúlio Vargas, has allowed Italo Balbo to be received at the palace. It's already something, it's already a signal, but the major signal comes a couple of years later. Yes, because in 1933, in the middle of summer, from July 1 to August 12, Italo Balbo leads a squadron of seaplanes. From Robotello to Canada and the United States, the so-called decennial cruise goes down in history, to the point that Balbo becomes a public figure, a character of the Gazette, a star, a celebrity, a man who appears on stamps, from magazine covers, from newspapers, from radio programs, from cinema. Italo Balbo perhaps becomes the respectable face of fascism abroad. When he arrives in Chicago, the mayor of Chicago even dedicates the Italo Balbo's Avenue to him. And not only the Sioux, the Native Americans, give him an honorary title, they call him Chief Flying Eagle. The popularity of Italo Balbo is so incredible that even in Italy, someone starts to ask some questions. Unlike Mussolini, Balbo speaks good English, among other things. He appears on American radio and gives a speech in English, explaining, illustrating the flight, and bringing prestige to his country. For Italian Americans, but even more so for Americans, the WASPs, who have always looked suspiciously, not to say worse, at Italians. With Balbo, the tune changes. Balbo is a character. One must take him into account. Upon his return to Italy, Balbo is promoted to Marshal of Italy, the highest he could aspire to. But at that moment, Balbo also realizes that he has made a very powerful enemy. He's not a general, he's not an admiral, he's not a Catholic priest, he's not even an anti-fascist. He's the worst enemy he could have. It's him, it's Mussolini. Yes, because the leader does not appreciate it. Mussolini has realized that Balbo is stealing his spotlight. Abroad, people talk much more about Italo Balbo than about Mussolini and fascism. And the dictator really doesn't like this. It comes to the point where Mussolini forbids newspapers from publishing Balbo's name more than once a month. The popular Minkel gives precise directives. Balbo has become cumbersome and will become increasingly cumbersome and uncomfortable because Balbo will become the critical voice of fascism. For example, Balbo does not like the alliance with Hitler. He judges it to be disproportionate, dangerous. He does not like the adventure in Spain. After the conquest of Ethiopia, which anyway cost a lot in terms of money, and not only to Italy, the Italian armed forces would need to reorganize, modernize. Instead, Mussolini went on an adventure, sending as many as 4 divisions, disguised as volunteer troops, to Spain, with a waste of materials and money. Money that could have been spent differently. The adventure in Spain is costly and does not bring any technological progress, unlike what happens, for example, in Nazi Germany, which can instead field test the Stukas, the Inkels, and the 88mm flak cannons. The Italian troops are not doing well in Spain. Balbo is aware of this and begins to criticize the regime. He becomes even more critical in 1938 when Mussolini, to please Hitler, enacts the racial laws. Balbo is a bit displeased because he has Jewish friends. He grew up in Ferrara, not far from the Ravenna family, a very prominent Jewish family in the city. He is a friend of the Ravenna family and has many Jewish friends, some of whom are members of the National Fascist Party. Balbo disapproves when he is sent to Libya in a sort of golden exile, far from Rome, far from the worldliness, far from the spotlight. Balbo administers the colony as he wants. He is forced to comply with racial laws, requiring Jewish merchants to keep open on Saturday, not to observe the Sabbath, but he does not take restrictive measures. He refuses to arrest Jews when asked by the Germans, as it goes against his beliefs and way of doing things. Things get even worse when Hitler signs through his own Minister Fori far too much. The pact with Stalin is a kind of affront to Balbo, who believes that the German has gone too far, that he has broken the steel pact signed just a few weeks earlier, with Italy in doing so. In short, Italo Balbo becomes Benito Mussolini's #1 enemy in Libya. Balbo brings his experience, brings his charisma, brings his way of organizing life, founds schools, establishes assistance associations, promotes infrastructure, so much so that the coastal road will be named in his honor Balbia Road. He helps the Italian settlers who come from Calabria and Veneto to try to transform the desert into a small garden, especially in the Cyrenaic Gibel, where the efforts of Italian farmers will also lead to the birth of an aqueduct. When war breaks out in Europe, Balbo begs Mussolini not to join Hitler's madness. Balbo knows very well that Italy is not ready. It is not ready at that moment. It will not be soon. According to Balbo's and other military calculations, it would take 2, maybe 3 years for Italy to be ready to enter the war, regardless of the side it would support. Italy cannot afford the effort, but in the end, Mussolini will be dazzled by Hitler's easy successes. First in Poland, then in Norway, finally in Benelux in France to enter the conflict. The famous phrase about the hundreds of deaths to be thrown on the table of peace. Balbo is not happy. Balbo is absolutely not in favor. But Balbo is forced to obey. And the military situation in Libya immediately appears quite complex.
Not so much.
For the double front, because after all, there are only small skirmishes at the border with the French. And after just a few days of war, France capitulates, thus closing the Tunisian front. The problems are in Cyrenaica on the border with Egypt. Balbo is in command of an army, but it's a foot army, lacking a real armored component. The few tanks that are there are terrible. They are the L3 tankettes, or they are the M11 tanks that have a very limited war value, while the English, who are numerically inferior, focus on mobility. The pinpricks, the armored car patrols that burst from the border, attack the strongholds, terrorize them, sometimes put the garrisons to flight and then return to Egypt. Balbo Fabo does what he can, requisitions the trucks, has pieces of artillery or machine guns mounted, invents the so-called motorized patrols, which shuttle between the various strongholds along the border, to try to intercept the armored car, or at least deter it from these offensive moves. Then he uses his beloved air weapon. He uses the airplanes that are there to try to limit the incursions of the armored car. In fact, in mid-June, he even has himself photographed after his plane attacked an isolated English armored car in the desert and forced it to retreat. This is one of Italo Balbo's final photos. On June 28, 1940, Balbo took off from Derna, intending to reach the coastal fortress of Tobruk. Balbo takes the controls of a tri-engine Savoia Marchetti, 79, a very common tri-engine in the Royal Air Force. It's a tactical bombing, torpedo bomber, transport plane. It can do a bit of everything. It's very versatile and widely used, although it lacks the capabilities of a twin-engine aircraft. He takes the wheel of this Savoia Marchetti 79 and is accompanied by another tri-engine. He starts to fly and is informed that there is an Allied raid in Tobruk. Not from the ground, from the sky, a bombing does not weigh us down. Balbo's plane and the other Savoia Marchetti 79 arrive over Tobruk when the Allied air raid has long been over. From the cockpit, Balbo sees columns of smoke rising from the port area, where the British have hit some gasoline depots. He wants to land, he wants to assess the situation, he wants to land so quickly that he doesn't warn the Tobruk control actor. He is convinced that the livery of his plane, the fact that it is a tri-engine, the name painted on the fuselage, code name, is enough to identify him. This is not the case because while his airplane is approaching the airport, right from the port of Tobruk, an anti-aircraft shot is fired. Very dense, guided by the old cruiser San Giorgio, an old warship that has been moored offshore as a floating battery. It is said that a shot fired from one of the cannons of the San Giorgio manages to hit Balbo's plane squarely. The plane with him, flown by General Porro, diverts, dodges the shots, and departs. Balbo's plane, which was completing the approach maneuver to the airport, is instead hit squarely, to the point that it catches fire and crashes to the ground. Everyone dies, Balbo dies, his co-pilots die, even Nello Quindich, who was with him, dies, probably to document the flight of the Marshal of Italy, as well as the governor of Libya. And it is at this moment that the dark legend about the death of Italo Balbo is born. At this moment, more than one person is asking, was that cannon shot, that anti-aircraft fire, a fatal and tragic accident, or was it intentional? Perhaps they wanted to eliminate an enemy, the Mussolinis. Perhaps they took the opportunity to solve a problem of the regime at its root. Countess Florio, the widow of Italo Balbo, is convinced of this, who for a long time has maintained that her husband's death was personally orchestrated by Mussolini. Balbo's widow, Mrs. Florio, is convinced of this, to the point of informing the prefect of Ferrara and filing a complaint with the chief of police. The chief of police, who reports Rome and receives a request to keep the lady calm and to monitor her movements anyway. The lady will not be quiet. She will continue for the rest of her life. She goes so far as to say that her husband was against the conflict and that someone in Rome wanted him dead at all costs. It's not enough that the alleged author of the killer blow, the headman Claudio Marsola of the cruiser San Giorgio, says it was a fatality taking responsibility for that fatal blow. It's not even enough that the various investigations conducted over time, not only by the military but also by independent researchers, affirm indeed that it was a tragic fatality. Even right-wing men like Indro Montanelli and Mario Cervi, authors of a series titled History of Italy, which, for those who don't have it, I invite you at least to browse. It can be found in all libraries in Italy. They supported precisely the tragedy. Even Arrigo Pitaco, perhaps one of the greatest historians regarding Libya, and not only confirmed the thesis of the tragic accident. Yet conspiracy theories continued to circulate to the point that a few years later, several years later, Polco Quilici was approached by a Navy guard, a former Navy guard named Aldo Massa, who on that day, at the end of June 1940, was in a coastal bunker in Tobruk and had noticed the presence of an Italian submarine in the bay. The Marcantonio Bragadino, which was not supposed to be there, which was not registered anywhere, which had arrived just before the Allied raid, and that had left shortly after the plane from Bari had crashed to the ground in flames. Perhaps the fatal blow did not come from San Giorgio, but from this submarine. If that was true, why did the Marcantonio Bragadino ship arrive from Naples and depart right away? Why not take responsibility? Responsibility? Sure, this is also a compelling argument. Of course, there is no tangible proof of a full intention by Mussolini or any other hierarch to kill Italo Balbo. What we know is that with the death of Balbo, the Italian colony of Libya essentially dies. It dies because Rodolfo Graziani, the butcher of the Cyrenaic Giebel, the man who had terrorized the local populations with concentration camps, reprisals, and indiscriminate massacres, will return in place of Balbo. Graziani will also be the author of the defeat at Sidi Albarani in early December 1940. He will be taken by such a nervous breakdown that he will flee with the remnants of his divisions to Sirte. Then another man will arrive, a man with a low seat and protruding cheekbones, trying to straighten the situation. But he will find a colony of Libya cut in half, a Giebel invaded by the English. The aqueduct, that the Italian colonists had made with so much effort, devastated and moved to Egypt at that point to supply fresh water to the British troops. It's a rather serious military situation. A man who came from afar to try to fix things. A man we will talk about soon in a series dedicated to him, a man named Irwin.